Hello and welcome to this bite-sized webinar series. My name is Kerry Hammock and I'm a consultant with the Compliance People. Today I'll be talking to you about waste transfer notes in England and Wales. So on this webinar today we are going to cover what waste transfer notes are and why we need them, information that's required on a waste transfer note, how to correctly complete one, and what annual waste transfer notes are. So let's start with the basics. Waste transfer notes are required for all transfers of non-hazardous waste to another party or site. They may also be called waste information notes, just waste notes, or waste paperwork. In my experience, usually a waste ticket isn't the same thing as a waste transfer note, as it doesn't have all of the required information on it. It's normally just a ticket to say that the waste has been taken, sort of like a delivery note. Section 34 of the Environmental Protection Act 1990 sets out a statutory duty of care for the importing, producing, keeping, treating or disposing of waste, and this applies to all parties in the waste chain. Waste transfer notes allow the regulator to understand what wastes are being generated and how they're being disposed of or recovered. In England, the regulator is the Environment Agency, and in Wales, it's Natural Resources Wales. Transfer notes provide a clear paper trail from when the waste is produced to when it's disposed of, so you can clearly see cradle to grave. They're also a legal requirement and must contain all of the relevant information. So what is non-hazardous waste? Waste is considered non-hazardous when it doesn't cause direct harm to people in the environment, for example, paper, wood or plastic. Essentially, it means that waste doesn't contain hazardous properties. That's not to say it can't be damaging if stored or treated in the wrong way. For example, if food waste is left to leach and attract flies, but the food waste itself is not inherently hazardous, hence is classified as non-hazardous waste. So what information is required on a waste transfer note? You need a description of the waste, any processes the waste has been through, how the waste is contained and or packaged, the quantity of the waste, so the weight, the place and date of the waste transfer, details of the permit, licence or exemption of the person receiving the waste, the licence or registration number of the person handing over the waste, if they have a waste management licence or are a registered carrier of controlled waste, the appropriate European Waste Catalogue code, EWC code, the SIC code of your business, so the standard industry code, and a statement that the waste hierarchy has been applied. The law is really specific about what waste transfer notes must contain, and it's really important that none of this stuff is missed. Also, auditors really love to check this kind of thing when doing external audits. I'm going to go over each of these in more detail, as I appreciate it's quite a comprehensive list. It's just worth noting, however, that all of this information doesn't have to be on an actual waste transfer note. It can be on any form of documentation, as long as all the required information is there. And waste transfer notes can also be in a paper format or electronic. So on this slide, you'll be able to see an example of a waste transfer note. And this is a template taken from the Environment Agency's website. And you can download one for use if you'd like to do so. It's just one way of setting out a waste transfer note. And you can see many different versions of this. So as long as you've got all of the information required, then that's fine. It's got 4 parts to it, parts A to D. As I've mentioned, you can use different formats as long as all the information needed is on there. You must correctly classify the waste, however, and you can use Technical Guidance WM3 to do this, which I'll explain in more detail later on. You must retain copies of all waste transfer notes for a minimum of 2 years, and that's a legal requirement. So now we're going to work our way through each section of the transfer note, starting with section A, which is about identifying the waste. So we want to know exactly what the waste is, clearly explain it, how it's contained, and write down how much of it there is. So firstly, we'll describe the waste. For example, is it paper? Is it card? Is it wood? We then want to know how the waste is contained. So is it in a skip, Is it in a sack? Is it perhaps loose? How much of the waste actually is there? So what's the weight of it? We also then want to put in the European Waste Catalogue Code or List of Waste Code. Now, common codes for certain types of waste can be found on the Environment Agency website via the link at the bottom of the slide here. And this can be quite useful if you're not sure how to classify waste. However, it's better to use the full list in the Technical Guidance WM3, which I'll go on to explain a bit more about now. So this is what WM3 looks like, and the document provides guidance on waste classification. It's a really comprehensive reference manual for anyone involved in the producing, managing or regulating of waste. And the key bit you need to know about is Appendix A, because that includes the waste classification codes. And these are also known as the LOW or List of Waste Codes, or EWC, European Waste Catalogue Codes. And this is for hazardous and non-hazardous waste. The document doesn't provide guidance on packaging and labelling of waste for transport. It's mainly about classification. A word of warning though, it is very long. It's 185 pages. So the key bit you need to know about, as I mentioned, is Appendix A, because that identifies your waste codes. It can be quite complicated to use, and there's a way to read it and an order in which you're meant to check the chapters in Appendix A to get the right code. However, this is beyond the scope of the training today. You just need to find out where the most common waste codes are and the ones that are relevant to you. So how do we identify a waste code? Well, each waste has its own individual 6-digit code. And this comes from the European Waste Catalogue, which contains 20 chapters that relate either to a process that generated the waste or to a specific waste type. The chapters are each given a 2-digit number. So for example, chapter 20 is municipal waste, and it's really important that we use the correct code. If the waste code has an asterisk by it, it means it's hazardous. So we don't need to use these ones when dealing with non-hazardous waste and waste transfer notes. So the wastes are listed according to the industrial process or business activity that produced them. And some examples are Chapter 3, which is waste from wood processing and the production of panels, furniture, pulp, and paper and cardboard. Chapter 20, which is one of the most common chapters, and this is for municipal wastes. So household waste and similar commercial, industrial and institutional waste, including separately collected fractions. And another example, which is quite common, is waste packaging. So that's absorbents, wiping cloths, filter materials, and any protective clothing not otherwise specified. So now we'll move on to section B of the waste transfer note, and this is all about the current holder of the waste. So this is giving us information about where the waste has come from and any authorisations that might be in place. It also identifies who the producer of the waste is, as waste might be handled by more than one company before it's actually been disposed of. So this section needs to have the name and address of the transferor on it. So the transferor is the current holder of the waste. Need to identify if the transferor is the producer of the waste. To state if they hold an environmental permit or exemption and or a waste carrier's registration. Also need to tick to confirm that the waste hierarchy has been applied and sign to this effect in section D later on. And also need to include the SIC code for the business premises that produced the waste. So what is a SIC code? As mentioned in section B of the transfer note, you need to put a SIC code for the business premises that produce the waste. And on a standard waste transfer note from the Environment Agency, this information is required in Part B. A SIC code is basically a system of classifying industries, and it's also used for financial and business administration. And SIC, S-I-C, stands for Standard Industry Classification. It's a 4-digit code. For example, the code for manufacture of paperboard is 1712. You might also see this written down as 17.12 and this is the old style of writing it with the dot in the middle, and it's not a big deal if that's not correct, as long as you've got the correct numbers there. If you're not sure what the SIC code for your company is, you can check on Companies House. Also, if you search on Companies House, it will be listed under the correct SIC code. So the waste hierarchy. As mentioned in section B, the producer of the waste or the waste transferor has to sign and tick to say that they've applied the waste hierarchy. So what is the waste hierarchy? Well, it's been in place since 2011 and was introduced by the Waste Framework Directive, and it identifies 5 steps that you can see on the slide here for dealing with waste in order of priority. So it shows the order of priority you should apply when you make decisions about the resources used and the waste generated by your business. And it takes into account the environmental impact of different waste management operations. So, for example, the best is prevention at the top of the triangle there, with the worst option being disposal, as it has the greatest impact on the environment. Applying the waste hierarchy is also a requirement if you have an environmental permit. An example of where the waste hierarchy might not be applied is if a company throws all of their waste into the same skip without any segregation or any recycling. So, a statement confirming that you've fulfilled your duty to apply the waste hierarchy as required by Regulation 12 of the Waste England Wales Regulations 2011. This is what you might see on lots of waste transfer notes, and this is where you sign and tick to say that you've complied with that statement. So you need to tick and sign to say that you've adhered to it, and all parties in the waste chain must apply the waste hierarchy. It's not just the producer's responsibility to do so. So we'll move on to section C now, and this section of the transfer note is all about the person collecting the waste, often known as the transferee. So in this section, you need to have the name and address of the transferee, and this is the person who's collecting the waste. You need to state if they're a local authority or not. State if they hold an environmental permit, an exemption, and/or a waste carrier's registration, and if so, include details of that, including the permit number or registration number. And it's worth bearing in mind that the person collecting the waste must always have a valid waste carrier's registration. And if that's to collect your business waste, it will be an upper tier registration, and that must be in date and not have expired. And you can check that on the Environment Agency Public Register. So now we move on to the final section of the waste transfer note, section D, and this is all about the actual transfer of the waste. So in this section, we need to have the address of the actual transfer or collection point, so where the waste is being collected from, the time and date of the transfer, and it needs to be made clear in this section if it's a broker or dealer that has arranged the transfer of the waste, and if so, to give their details. And both parties must sign the waste transfer note, so that's the transferor and the transferee. So the person collecting the waste and the waste producer or holder of the waste where it's being collected from. So now let's recap what needs to be on a waste transfer note. So we're going to use the Environment Agency form here to recap. It's easier if this format is used when you're doing waste transfer notes, as it covers everything you need. It's a bit more difficult to check that if it's on a different form. You just need to be a bit more vigilant to check all the information's there. So let's work through the sections. So section A here, we need to have the waste description and the EWC code, and also include the quantity of waste and the type of container it's in. In section B, we've got the waste hierarchy declaration. So we need to make sure here that we've ticked, and then we've also signed later on in section D. We also need to have here in section B details of the waste producer. So if this is a company, it could be the head office with the address here. And we also need the 2007 Standard Industry Classification Code. Then we need the waste carrier, broker and/or dealer number. So that's the registration number. We also need the waste carrier name and address. So the waste carrier could be registered with the Environment Agency or Natural Resources Wales, depending on where you are. So you need to make sure you've got the registration number correct. We also need the waste site name in section D and the address, and this is where the transfer of waste is taking place, so where it's being collected from. And it can be the same as section B, unless the site location is different. And then finally, we need the signatures. So we need this from the waste producer or holder and the waste contractor, so the carrier of the waste. And we also need the date here too. So as well as standalone waste transfer notes, we can also have annual waste transfer notes, also known as season tickets. And these are basically a single waste transfer note that covers a series of non-hazardous waste transfers. And these can last for up to a year, and they're used for regular transfers of the same type of non-hazardous waste with the same waste carrier. So if you've got several sites serviced by the same carrier with the same type of waste collected, they can also be listed on a schedule to the season ticket. So as I said, they're for movements of non-hazardous waste only, and these are of the same types and quantities using the same contractors to and from the same sites. And you can have a single waste transfer note covering a year period, often called a season ticket, but it's really important that you also keep a record of the collection times and the quantities of waste collected, and this might be recorded on the delivery ticket that you get each time the carrier comes to collect your waste. It's really important that you still retain all records of these for 2 years, just as you would with any other waste transfer note. And it needs to be really clear on the waste transfer note the dates that the annual transfer runs between. So then, in summary, the waste producer's obligations apply right up until the point of disposal, not just from when the waste is being collected. You must use a registered waste carrier. You must check that the waste is taken to a permitted site, so that's a site that has an appropriate environmental permit, waste management license, or waste exemption. You also need to keep proof of the above and the waste transfer note, which has the waste description, the European Waste Catalogue Code, the producer and carrier details, the producer's SIC Code, 2 signatures and dates, and also acknowledgement of the waste hierarchy. Copies also need to be kept for a minimum of 2 years, and this is a legal requirement and can be requested by the regulator at any point. Thank you very much for listening.